What happens when a king is so desperate to pay off his gambling debts that he gives away his own daughter as payment? When Princess Elara discovered she had been sold like an object to settle her father's debts, she thought her life was over. But what she didn't expect was to discover that the man who bought her wasn't the monster she had imagined. King Aldwin owed 75,000 gold crowns, a fortune that could buy entire kingdoms, to Gareth Blackwood, a commoner who had become the most feared debt collector in 3 kingdoms. When Gareth demanded the princess's hand as payment, no one expected what would happen next. This isn't just another arranged marriage story. This is the incredible journey of a princess who discovered that sometimes a person's true worth isn't found in their birthright, but in their character, and of a common man who proved that true love can bloom from the most unlikely circumstances. Today I'm going to tell you an epic story about power, debt, class prejudice, and a romance that challenged every rule of medieval society. A story that will show you how 2 people destined to hate each other ended up changing not only their own lives, but the fate of an entire kingdom. But first, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love seeing our global community grow. And if you're ready for a story that combines royal drama, epic romance, and a powerful lesson about never judging someone by appearances, smash that like button and subscribe with notifications on. Because what Princess Elara discovered about her buyer will surprise you as much as it surprised the entire royal court. Are you ready to learn the truth behind this impossible marriage? King Aldwin stared at the parchment before him, the damning numbers written in stark black ink that seemed to mock his royal pride. The kingdom's coffers were empty, the royal treasury depleted by years of war and poor harvests. But it was not the state's debt that haunted him now, it was his personal gambling debts that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The man sitting across from him in the dimly lit chamber was not a noble lord or a wealthy merchant, but Gareth Blackwood, a commoner whose sharp mind had turned him from a simple blacksmith's apprentice into the most feared debt collector in 3 kingdoms. The irony was not lost on either of them. Here sat a king, supposedly chosen by divine right to rule over millions, begging for mercy from a man who had been born in the gutters of the capital's poorest district. Gareth's rise to power was the stuff of legends whispered in taverns and noble salons alike. A brilliant orphan who had clawed his way from nothing to become the shadow banker to half the continent's elite. His network of spies, informants, and loyal followers rivaled that of any royal intelligence service, and his wealth had grown to surpass that of many small kingdoms. "Your Majesty," Gareth said quietly, his voice carrying no mockery despite the irony of the situation. "The debt stands at 50,000 gold crowns. With interest accumulated over 2 years of non-payment, we're looking at nearly 75,000. He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease despite being in the presence of royalty. His dark hair was pulled back simply, his clothes fine but not ostentatious. Everything about him spoke of a man who had earned his power through cunning rather than birthright. The king's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine goblet. How had it come to this? How had knights of cards and dice with foreign dignitaries led to owing such an astronomical sum to a man who should have been beneath his notice? The gambling had started as a way to secure diplomatic alliances, friendly games with visiting royalty that had gradually escalated into high-stakes affairs where kingdoms' worth of gold changed hands on the turn of a card. Aldwin had always been lucky before, but luck, as Gareth well knew, was a fickle mistress. I need more time," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The kingdom's finances are strained, but surely we can arrange something. Perhaps a payment plan, or collateral of some kind." Gareth's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, in his steel-gray eyes. "Your Majesty, you've had 2 years. My other clients have begun to question my effectiveness. I cannot appear weak, not even for a king." He stood slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the ornate chamber. The candlelight played across his features, highlighting the sharp intelligence that had made him both feared and respected throughout the known world. "However, I am not unreasonable. There are other forms of payment we might consider." The king's head snapped up, hope flickering in his desperate eyes like a dying candle suddenly catching wind. "Name it. Lands, titles, anything you desire. I could make you a duke, grant you estates that would make you one of the wealthiest landowners in the kingdom. Your daughter, Gareth said simply, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Princess Elara. Give her to me as my wife, and we'll consider the debt settled in full. The silence that followed was deafening. King Aldwin felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, as if the very foundations of reality had shifted beneath his feet. His daughter, his beloved Elara, the light of his life, the most precious thing in his kingdom, handed over to a commoner like a piece of property to satisfy a gambling debt. The very thought made his stomach churn with revulsion and shame, yet what choice did he have? Refusing would mean war, would mean the destruction of everything he had worked to protect, everything his ancestors had built over centuries of careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. She would never consent, he stammered weakly, grasping at straws. Elara has a strong will, she would refuse such an arrangement. Gareth's smile was cold but not cruel, the expression of a man who had learned to be pragmatic about the harsh realities of power. That, Your Majesty, is not her choice to make. The debt is yours, not hers. But I will promise you this, she will be treated with the respect and care befitting a princess. She will want for nothing, and I will protect her with my life. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle like dust in the stillness of the chamber. Do we have an agreement? Princess Elara stood before the great mirror in her chambers, her lady-in-waiting brushing her long auburn hair with practiced strokes. At 22, she was considered by many to be the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and her spirit had never been broken by the constraints of royal protocol. She had expected to marry for political alliance eventually, but always to someone of equal station, someone her father had carefully chosen after months of negotiation and consideration. The life of a princess was one of careful preparation for exactly such a destiny. Since childhood, she had been tutored in languages, diplomacy, history, and the subtle arts of court intrigue that would serve her well as a queen consort. She spoke 4 languages fluently, and could navigate the treacherous waters of noble society with grace and intelligence, understanding that her marriage would be as much a matter of state as of heart. Yet she had always assumed that her future husband would be chosen with at least some consideration for her preferences and compatibility. The knock on her door came just after sunset, interrupting her evening routine. "Enter," she called, expecting it to be a servant with her evening meal. Instead, her father stepped into the room, his face ashen and his usual confident bearing replaced by something that looked disturbingly like defeat. Her lady-in-waiting immediately curtsied and withdrew, recognizing the signs of a private family conversation that required discretion. "Father!" Elara rose from her chair, concern flooding her features as she took in his appearance. King Aldwin looked as though he had aged a decade in a single day, his shoulders bowed under some invisible weight that threatened to crush him entirely. "You look unwell. Has something happened with the northern borders? Have we received troubling news from our ambassadors?" King Aldwin couldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixing on some point beyond her shoulder as if looking directly at his daughter would cause him physical pain. How could he tell her? How could he explain that his weakness, his addiction to games of chance, had led to this moment of ultimate betrayal? How could a father look his beloved child in the eye and explain that he had essentially sold her to pay for his own failures? "Elara, my dear daughter, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." His voice cracked slightly on the words, the controlled tone of a king giving way to desperate pleading of a man who had run out of options. "There have been complications. Financial complications that affect not just the security of our kingdom, but our family's honor and future." Elara's brow furrowed as she studied her father's face, her political instincts immediately alert to the gravity of the situation. She had always been more interested in statecraft than most princesses, often sitting in on council meetings when her father allowed it. She knew the kingdom's finances were strained, recent wars had been expensive, and harvest failures had reduced tax revenues significantly. But surely they were not at the point of complete crisis? "What kind of complications?" she asked carefully, her mind already working to understand the implications. "Can we not raise taxes or seek loans from our traditional allies?" Surely the Kingdom of Astoria would be willing to provide financial assistance given our historical agreements. It's not the kingdom's debt, Elara. The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would somehow lessen their devastating impact. It's mine. Personal debts that have grown far beyond my ability to repay through normal means. I've made some very poor decisions, engaged in activities that were unbecoming of a king, and now the consequences have come to collect. The admission hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Elara felt something cold and terrible settle in the pit of her stomach as the implications began to dawn on her. Personal debts meant gambling debts, meant that her father had risked not just his own honor but the stability of the entire kingdom on games of chance that had clearly not gone in his favor. "How much?" she asked quietly, her political mind already working to understand the full scope of the disaster they were facing. 75,000 gold crowns. The number hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs as if she had been struck by a mailed fist. It was more money than most nobles would see in a lifetime, more than many small kingdoms had in their entire treasuries, enough to fund a small army for several years or build a dozen castles. The sheer magnitude of the debt was almost impossible to comprehend. "To whom do you owe this sum?" she whispered, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "A man named Gareth Blackwood. He's a commoner, but one with considerable power and influence in certain circles." King Aldwin began pacing, unable to remain still under his daughter's steady gaze, unable to bear the weight of her disappointment and growing understanding. "He has made me an offer to settle the debt entirely, to wipe clean the slate and restore our honor." Something cold and terrible settled in Elara's stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. She had been raised in a royal court. She understood the nature of deals and bargains, of payments that weren't always made in gold or silver. When a creditor offered to settle a debt entirely, there were always strings attached, always prices to be paid that went beyond mere money. "What does he want?" she asked, though the tremor in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "You." The word hung between them like a sword, sharp and final and irrevocable. "He wants you as his wife. Marriage to the princess would settle the debt completely, and he has given his word that you would be treated well, that you would want for nothing, that you would be protected and honored as befits your station." Elara sank back into her chair, the enormity of what her father was telling her washing over her in waves. She was to be sold, essentially, to pay for his gambling debts. To a commoner, no less. Not even a political alliance that might benefit the kingdom, but simply a transaction to clear her father's conscience and his ledgers. The wedding ceremony was unlike anything the kingdom had ever witnessed, a surreal spectacle that seemed to mock every tradition and expectation that had governed royal marriages for centuries. Princess Elara stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk and gold thread that had cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, her face a mask of royal composure that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. The dress had been specially commissioned for the occasion, its intricate beadwork and delicate embroidery a testament to the finest craftsmanship in the kingdom, yet it felt like a beautiful shroud, gorgeous but suffocating. Beside her stood Gareth Blackwood, dressed in fine black velvet that had been tailored to perfection, looking every inch the gentleman despite his common birth. The transformation was remarkable. The debt collector who had sat across from her father in that dimly lit chamber now appeared as polished and refined as any duke or prince. His dark hair had been expertly styled, his beard trimmed to perfection, and his bearing spoke of a confidence that came not from centuries of inherited privilege but from personal achievement and hard-won power. The great cathedral was filled with confused nobles who whispered behind their fans and prayer books, their voices creating a low buzz of scandal and speculation that threatened to overwhelm the solemnity of the occasion. Never before had they witnessed such a mismatch of stations, such a blatant violation of the social order that governed their world. Dukes and duchesses who could trace their lineages back 1,000 years sat in uncomfortable proximity to merchants and traders who had earned Gareth's favor through business dealings, creating an unprecedented mixing of social classes. Gareth had insisted on a proper royal wedding, sparing no expense despite the circumstances of their arrangement. "If I am to marry a princess," he had told the king during the planning discussions, "then she will have a wedding worthy of her station. I will not have it said that I treated her with anything less than the respect due to royal blood. The gesture had surprised Elara, though she remained wary of his motives. Was it genuine respect for her position, or simply a calculated display of his newfound power and wealth? The cathedral itself had been transformed for the occasion, with thousands of white roses and golden ribbons adorning every surface, their sweet fragrance filling the air and creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls, their flickering light creating an otherworldly ambience that seemed to blur the lines between reality and fantasy. The royal choir sang hymns of love and devotion with voices that soared to the vaulted ceiling. As they spoke their vows, Elara studied her new husband's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. He was undeniably handsome in a rugged way, with strong features that spoke of character forged through hardship rather than softened by privilege, and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calculating precision. His voice was deep and steady as he promised to love, honor, and protect her, words that rang with sincerity despite the nature of their union. When it came time for her to speak the same words, she did so with the dignity of a princess who had been trained from birth to perform her duties regardless of personal cost, even as her heart rebelled against the situation that had brought them to this moment. The words felt strange on her tongue, promising to love a man she barely knew, to honor someone who had essentially purchased her like a piece of valuable property. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, almost hesitant, and Elara was surprised to find that Gareth's lips were warm and soft against hers, his touch carrying none of the dominance or possession she had expected. There was no demand in the gesture, no claim of ownership, simply the formal completion of a ceremony that had bound them together in the eyes of God and kingdom. For a brief moment, she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his expression. The wedding feast that followed was a surreal experience that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of reality. Nobles who had never acknowledged Gareth's existence now bowed and scraped before him with transparent desperation, their hypocrisy evident in their sudden deference to wealth and power over bloodline and tradition. Elara watched it all with a mixture of disgust and fascination, beginning to understand the complex web of motivations and fears that governed the world of politics and power. "You're very quiet, wife," Gareth said softly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him above the revelry and music that filled the great hall. "Are you plotting my demise, or simply enduring until you can escape to your chambers and pretend this day never happened?" His directness caught her completely off guard, the casual way he acknowledged the strangeness of their situation both refreshing and unsettling. Most men in his position would have ignored her mood entirely or offered empty platitudes about her beauty and their future happiness together, but Gareth seemed determined to confront reality head-on, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. "I'm observing," she replied honestly, surprising herself with her willingness to engage with him on such direct terms. "Trying to understand the man I've been bound to, attempting to make sense of what my life has become in the space of a single ceremony." "And what have you concluded so far?" he asked, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her thoughts. Gareth's estate was a revelation that challenged everything Elara had expected, shattering her preconceived notions about nouveau riche excess and common-born tastelessness. Rather than the crude, ostentatious display of new wealth she had anticipated, golden statues and gaudy furnishings that screamed of money without refinement, she found herself in an elegant manor house that could have housed royalty with complete comfort and grace. The architecture was a masterful blend of classical design and modern innovation, with soaring ceilings, graceful archways, and windows positioned to capture the best light throughout the day. The estate was surrounded by carefully tended gardens that took her breath away with their sophisticated beauty and obvious attention to detail. Ancient oak trees provided shade for winding paths that led through carefully curated flowerbeds, herb gardens that filled the air with intoxicating fragrances, and ornamental ponds that reflected the sky like polished mirrors. It was clear that whoever had designed these grounds possessed not just unlimited resources but genuine appreciation for natural beauty and the patience to allow such splendor to develop over many years. Inside the manor, Elara discovered room after room filled with art and books that spoke of refined taste and genuine appreciation for culture and learning. The library alone was larger than most noble estates possessed, its shelves stretching from floor to ceiling and filled with volumes in multiple languages covering everything from classical philosophy to cutting-edge scientific treatises. Rare manuscripts sat alongside beautifully illustrated poetry collections, while maps and astronomical instruments suggested a mind curious about the world beyond immediate concerns. Her personal chambers were nothing short of magnificent, larger and more luxuriously appointed than her rooms at the palace, with windows overlooking a rose garden that seemed designed specifically to provide stunning beauty from her sitting area. The furniture was exquisite without being overwhelming, chosen for both comfort and elegance, while the color scheme of soft blues and warm golds created an atmosphere of serenity that immediately put her at ease despite her circumstances. "I had hoped you would find it suitable," Gareth said from the doorway, his voice carrying genuine concern as he watched her explore her new home. He had changed from his wedding attire into simpler clothes, dark breeches and a white shirt that was open at the throat, making him look younger and less intimidating than he had during the ceremony. The transformation was striking. Without the formal trappings, he appeared more like a country gentleman than the feared debt collector who had negotiated with kings. Elara turned from the window where she had been admiring the view, studying him with new eyes as she tried to reconcile the man before her with the reputation that had preceded him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked directly, her royal training having taught her the value of confronting difficult topics head-on. "We both know this marriage is nothing more than a business transaction, a way for you to collect a debt while gaining social legitimacy." "Is it?" Gareth stepped into the room but maintained a respectful distance, his body language carefully non-threatening as he seemed to consider his words. "Perhaps it began that way, but that doesn't mean it has to remain so. You are my wife now, Elara. Not my prisoner, not my property, but my wife. And I intend to treat you as such, with all the respect and consideration that position deserves." The sincerity in his voice was unexpected, and Elara found herself studying his face for signs of deception or manipulation. "Even though you know I'll never love you?" The words came out harsher than she had intended, but she needed to establish the boundaries of their relationship clearly from the beginning. She would not give him false hope, nor would she pretend emotions she didn't feel simply to make their arrangement more palatable. Something flickered across Gareth's features, pain, perhaps, or disappointment, but his voice remained steady and controlled when he replied. "Love is earned, not demanded or purchased. I don't expect your heart simply because I wear a wedding ring or because circumstances have brought us together. But I do hope that, in time, you might come to see me as more than just the man who bought you from your father's debts." That evening, they dined together in a smaller, more intimate dining room than the grand hall where the wedding feast had been held. The meal was exquisite, clearly prepared by a chef of considerable skill and training, and served by discreet servants who appeared and disappeared with practiced efficiency. Elara found herself relaxing despite her reservations, drawn into conversation about books, art, and politics that revealed depths to Gareth's character she hadn't expected from someone with his reputation. The discussion ranged from classical literature to contemporary political theory, from architectural styles to philosophical implications of recent scientific discoveries. Gareth demonstrated not just knowledge but genuine intellectual curiosity, asking thoughtful questions about her opinions and engaging with her ideas as equals rather than merely tolerating the conversation as a duty to his new wife. "You're remarkably well educated for someone of common birth," she observed, then immediately regretted the condescending tone of her words, which seemed to emphasize the class differences between them rather than acknowledging his obvious intelligence and learning. Gareth's smile was rueful rather than offended, suggesting he had heard such comments before and had learned to find them more amusing than insulting. "Self-educated, largely. When you grow up with nothing, you quickly learn that knowledge is the one thing that can't be taken away from you by circumstance or misfortune. I read everything I could get my hands on: philosophy, history, literature, treatises on economics and statecraft, scientific journals, anything that might help me understand how the world really works." "And is that what you've done? Used that understanding to change your place in the world?" "I've certainly tried," he replied thoughtfully. "Though I suspect that no matter how much wealth I accumulate, how many nobles bow to me out of necessity, there will always be those who see only a blacksmith's apprentice playing at being a gentleman." He met her eyes across the table with surprising vulnerability. Your father, for instance. Even as he handed you over to settle his debts, I could see the disgust in his eyes. Not at what he was doing, but at who he was doing it with. The weeks that followed their wedding established a routine that was both comfortable and strange, a delicate dance of mutual respect and careful boundaries that neither had expected when they first met in that tense negotiation over her father's debts. Gareth left each morning to attend to his various business interests, always immaculately dressed and carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had earned his place in the world through wit, determination, and an almost supernatural understanding of human nature and the mechanisms of power that governed their society. His business empire, Elara gradually learned, was far more extensive and complex than she had initially understood. He wasn't simply a debt collector or moneylender, but the center of a vast network that included shipping companies, mining operations, textile manufacturing, and even several banks that served both common merchants and noble families throughout the kingdom. His wealth wasn't just accumulated, but actively generated through investments and innovations that created employment for thousands of people while generating steady income that made him effectively immune to economic fluctuations. Elara was left to explore her new home and its extensive grounds during these absences, discovering libraries filled with rare books that would have been the envy of any university, art galleries that housed collections rivaling those of royal palaces, and gardens that were clearly tended with both considerable skill and genuine love for natural beauty. Every room seemed to reveal new facets of her husband's character, his appreciation for beauty, his intellectual curiosity, his attention to detail, and his apparent determination to surround himself with the finest things life had to offer. What surprised her most, however, was the way Gareth's servants treated her. Rather than the grudging deference she might have expected from people whose primary loyalty was to their master's interests, she found genuine warmth and respect that seemed to stem from their obvious affection for Gareth himself. They spoke of him not as a distant employer but as someone who had earned their devotion through consistent fairness and generosity, someone who remembered their names and asked about their families. Mrs. Henley, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for Gareth for nearly a decade, became a particular source of insight into her new husband's character and the kind of man he was when no one important was watching. The woman was clearly devoted to Gareth, but her loyalty seemed based on genuine respect rather than fear or financial dependence. "He's a good man, my lady," the woman said one afternoon as they walked through the herb garden, her weathered hands pointing out various plants and their uses. "Hard, yes, and sometimes ruthless in his business dealings when people try to cheat him or take advantage of his generosity, but never cruel for the sake of cruelty. Do you know that every servant in this house earns twice what they would elsewhere? And when my grandson took ill last winter with a fever that nearly killed him, the master paid for the finest physicians in the kingdom without being asked. Then why does he have such a fearsome reputation?" Elara asked, genuinely curious about the apparent contradiction between the man she was coming to know and the stories that circulated about him in noble circles and common taverns alike. Mrs. Henley's expression grew thoughtful as she considered how to explain the complexities of her employer's position in society. "Because kindness is seen as weakness in his world, my lady. The master learned early that if you want to protect what you've built, if you want to keep safe the people who depend on you, you must be willing to do whatever is necessary to defend it. He can't afford to show mercy to those who would destroy him, because they would see that mercy as an invitation to try again." These insights into Gareth's character began to shift Elara's perception of her situation in ways she hadn't expected. She started to notice small things that had escaped her attention before. The way he always asked about her day when he returned each evening, his genuine interest in her opinions on various subjects ranging from literature to politics, the careful respect he maintained for her person and her privacy despite the legal rights that marriage had given him over both. True to his word, he had kept his promise about not forcing anything from her that she wasn't prepared to give freely. They maintained separate bedchambers, and he never presumed upon the physical aspects of marriage that would normally be expected, never made her feel like property that he had purchased rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. One evening, as they sat in the library after dinner, sharing a bottle of wine and discussing a particularly complex treatise on agricultural innovations that Gareth had been studying, Elara found herself studying him as he read. The lamplight softened his strong features, and she could see the intelligence in his eyes as they moved across the pages, the genuine engagement with ideas that had nothing to do with profit or power, but simply reflected his curiosity about the world. "Why did you really want to marry me?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks finally finding voice in the comfortable intimacy of the quiet library. Gareth looked up from his book, considering his words carefully before responding, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he seemed to weigh how much truth he was willing to share. "There were practical considerations, of course. Marriage to a princess, even under these circumstances, grants a certain legitimacy to my social position that no amount of wealth could purchase. It opens doors that would otherwise remain forever closed to someone of my background." "And," she prompted, sensing there was more to his motivation than simple social climbing. "And I had heard stories about you, about your intelligence, your compassion for the people of the kingdom, your refusal to be merely decorative as so many nobles' daughters are content to be. When the opportunity arose to make you my wife, I found myself wanting to know if those stories were true, wanting to discover if there really was a princess who cared more about substance than appearances." Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks at his words, unexpected warmth spreading through her chest at the realization that he had been interested in her as a person rather than simply as a symbol or a prize to be won. "So I was an object of curiosity?" "No," Gareth said firmly, closing his book and giving her his full attention in a way that made her feel as though she was the only person in the world who mattered to him at that moment. "You are a woman I hoped might understand what it means to want something more than what circumstances have given you. Someone who might see past the surface to what lies beneath. Someone who might judge me by my actions rather than my origins." 3 months into their marriage, everything changed in a way that neither of them could have anticipated or prepared for, shattering the careful equilibrium they had built and forcing them to confront the reality of their bond in ways they had both been avoiding. Elara woke one morning to find Gareth already dressed and preparing to leave, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tension she had never seen before. His movements sharp and urgent as he gathered papers and weapons with the efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis. A messenger had arrived before dawn with news that would test everything they had built together. King Aldwin was dead, killed in what appeared to be a hunting accident but which bore all the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated assassination. The kingdom was in chaos as various noble factions vied for control in the absence of a clear succession plan, with several different claimants to the throne already beginning to gather armies and allies in preparation for what looked like an inevitable civil war. The political implications were staggering and immediate. Without a strong central authority, the kingdom faced the very real possibility of fragmenting into a dozen smaller states, each controlled by ambitious nobles who had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity to expand their power and influence. Trade routes would be disrupted, laws would become meaningless, and the common people would suffer as they always did when the powerful fought among themselves for dominance. "I have to go," Gareth said, his voice tight with urgency as he strapped on a sword that Elara had never seen him wear before, the weapon looking both natural and deadly in his capable hands. "There are those who will use this opportunity to challenge my position, to claim that my marriage to you was invalid without proper royal consent from a living king. If I don't act quickly, I could lose everything, including the legal protections that keep you safe from those who would use you as a pawn in their own games for power." The thought of losing everything he had built was clearly devastating to Gareth, but Elara could see that his concern for her safety was equally strong. In the chaos that would follow the king's death, a royal princess would be an incredibly valuable asset to anyone seeking to legitimize their claim to the throne, and her marriage to a commoner might be seen as grounds for annulment by ambitious nobles who wanted to use her bloodline for their own purposes. Elara felt the world shift beneath her feet as the full scope of their situation became clear. Her father was gone, the complicated, flawed man who had gambled away her freedom but who had also taught her to love learning and to care for their people's welfare was dead, likely murdered by those who saw his weaknesses as an opportunity for advancement. And now she faced the possibility of losing the strange, tentative peace she had found in her new life, the unexpected companionship she had discovered with a man she was only beginning to understand. "What will you do?" she asked, surprised by how much the thought of Gareth leaving, possibly forever, disturbed her, how the prospect of returning to the political machinations of court life filled her with dread rather than relief. "Whatever I must," he replied grimly, his gray eyes hard with determination and something that looked almost like desperation. I've spent years building my influence, my network of allies and obligations throughout the kingdom and beyond. Now I'll call in every favor, use every piece of leverage I possess, remind everyone who owes me money or depends on my goodwill exactly what they stand to lose if they betray me now. His confidence was reassuring, but Elara could see the uncertainty beneath it, the knowledge that even his considerable resources might not be enough to weather the storm that was coming. The nobles might despise his common birth, but they needed his wealth and his connections to maintain their own positions, a fact that gave him power but also made him a target for those who resented their dependence on him. As he prepared to leave, Elara made a decision that surprised them both, one that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her that she hadn't known existed until that moment. "I'm coming with you." Gareth turned, his expression incredulous as he tried to process what she had just said. "Absolutely not. The capital will be dangerous, full of plotting and betrayal and violence. You'll be safe here, protected by my household guard, and far from the chaos that's about to consume the kingdom." "I'll be irrelevant here," Elara countered, her royal training finally asserting itself as she realized what needed to be done. "But in the capital, I am still a princess, the late king's daughter, the last legitimate representative of the royal bloodline. My presence validates your position in ways that all your wealth and influence cannot. Together, we might be able to stabilize the situation and prevent civil war. Apart, we're both vulnerable to those who would use us for their own ends." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the chamber, and Elara realized that this was the first time she had truly thought of them as we, as partners rather than reluctant strangers bound by circumstances beyond their control. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating, a recognition that somewhere in the careful dance of their marriage, real bonds had begun to form between them. "You would do that?" Gareth asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested he hadn't expected such loyalty from someone who had been forced into marriage with him. "Stand with me before the nobles who will see our marriage as an abomination, support someone they consider beneath your station?" "I would do that," Elara confirmed, understanding as she spoke the words that something fundamental had shifted in her heart during their months together. She might not love this man yet, but she respected him, trusted him, and, perhaps most surprisingly, wanted to protect him from those who would use his common birth as a weapon against everything he had built through talent and determination. The journey to the capital took 3 days of hard travel, during which they rode in a well-appointed carriage surrounded by Gareth's most trusted men, a small army of professionals who were clearly prepared for trouble. It was during this journey that Elara began to understand the true scope of her husband's influence and the network of relationships he had built throughout the kingdom and beyond its borders. The confrontation came sooner than expected, erupting with the sudden violence of a summer storm that had been building pressure for hours before finally breaking. Within mere hours of arriving in the capital, Elara and Gareth found themselves standing before an emergency assembly of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, all of whom had gathered in the great throne room to discuss the succession crisis and the various claims to the throne that had emerged in the wake of King Aldwin's sudden death. The great hall of the royal palace, Elara's childhood home, where she had learned to walk and read and dance, buzzed with tension and barely concealed ambition as men who had spent their lives maneuvering for advantage saw an unprecedented opportunity to reshape the kingdom according to their own desires. The air was thick with whispered conversations, hasty alliances being formed and broken, and the kind of desperate scheming that emerged when a kingdom's entire political structure was suddenly thrown into chaos. Lord Varec, the most vocal opponent of their marriage, and a man whose own claim to the throne was tenuous at best, rose to address the assembly with the pompous confidence of someone who believed his noble blood gave him the right to speak for the entire kingdom. "We cannot ignore the elephant in this room," he declared, his voice carrying across the hall with theatrical authority designed to capture everyone's attention. "The late king's daughter has been sold like chattel to a common debt collector, a man whose very presence in this sacred hall is an insult to centuries of royal tradition." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Elara felt the eyes of everyone present turn to her and Gareth with a mixture of curiosity, disgust, and calculation. This was the moment that would define not just their marriage, but their future, and possibly the future of the entire kingdom. Everything they had built together, every bond they had formed, every hope they had for a peaceful resolution to the crisis, hung in the balance of what happened next. This arrangement has no legitimacy in the eyes of God or law, Varric continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the support of others in the room who shared his prejudices. Princess Elara remains unmarried in any meaningful sense, and therefore eligible to wed someone of appropriate station to stabilize our kingdom and provide the strong leadership we desperately need in these uncertain times. Gareth started to step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his sword as years of fighting for respect and recognition demanded that he respond to the challenge with the kind of force that his enemies would understand. But Elara stopped him with a gentle touch on his arm, a gesture that spoke of partnership and trust that neither of them had expected when they first met in that tense negotiation over her father's debts. When she spoke, her voice carried all the authority of her royal bloodline and education. Every lesson in statecraft and diplomacy that had been drilled into her since childhood now focused into a weapon more devastating than any sword. "Lord Varric speaks of legitimacy," she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the hall and silencing the whispered conversations that had been filling the air with tension. "Let me tell you what I have learned about legitimacy in these past months, about what it truly means to be worthy of power and respect." She stepped forward, every inch the princess she had been born to be, her bearing and presence commanding attention and respect in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or military might. It is not found in bloodlines that trace back to men who took power through conquest and held it through violence and intimidation. True legitimacy comes from understanding one's duty to the people, from working to improve their lives rather than simply maintaining one's own privilege and comfort. The hall erupted in murmurs and shocked whispers as the assembled nobles tried to process what they were hearing. A princess defending a commoner husband was unprecedented enough in their experience, but to suggest that common blood might be superior to noble blood was nothing short of revolutionary, a challenge to the very foundations of their social order. "My husband may have been born common," Elara continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm and her purpose, "but he has shown me more respect and consideration than many nobles show their wives. He has built schools and hospitals, created employment for hundreds of families, and yes, he has also been ruthless with those who would prey upon the weak and defenseless. If this is what common birth produces, then perhaps we need more commoners in positions of power." Gareth moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring as he faced the hostility of men who had spent their lives believing that birth was destiny. "My lords and ladies," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that reminded everyone present exactly why he had become so feared and respected. "I know what you think of me, the upstart who has forgotten his place, the debt collector who has grown too proud and ambitious for his own good." The silence that followed was profound and terrifying, as if the entire room was holding its breath while waiting for some inevitable explosion of violence or revelation that would change everything. Gareth's next words were delivered with the precision of a master swordsman making a killing thrust. "But I also know something else that might interest you. I know which of your debts are overdue and to whom you owe money you cannot repay. I know which of your estates are mortgaged beyond their value and which of your businesses are failing despite your attempts to hide their problems. I know which of your children have been quietly seeking my financial backing for their own ventures and which of your wives have been selling family jewels to maintain appearances." The impact of his words was immediate and devastating. In a single moment, Gareth had reminded every person in that room that his power was not theoretical or distant. It was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives, touching their finances, their families, their most carefully guarded secrets and vulnerabilities. "The kingdom needs stability," Elara continued, seizing the moment of shocked silence to drive home their point. "It needs leaders who understand both the challenges of governance and the realities of the world beyond these palace walls. My marriage to Gareth was not the end of my royal duty. It was the beginning of a new kind of service to our people." Lord Varric's face had gone red with anger and humiliation, but before he could respond, an elderly duke whom everyone respected for his wisdom and integrity rose slowly to his feet. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and observation, "it is time we judged people by their actions rather than their ancestry. Lord Gareth has proven his worth through deed, and Princess Elara has shown us today the wisdom and strength we will need in the difficult times ahead." As nods of agreement began to spread through the assembly like ripples on a pond, Elara felt Gareth's hand find hers. The gesture was subtle, hidden in the folds of her gown, but the warmth of his touch anchored her in this moment of triumph and transformation. They had won, not just the battle for legitimacy, but something more precious and enduring. In the months that followed, as they worked together to stabilize the kingdom and establish a regency until a proper succession could be determined, Elara discovered that love had indeed grown between them. Not the passionate romance of fairy tales, but something deeper and more enduring, a love built on respect, understanding, and shared purpose that would prove stronger than any debt that had brought them together, more valuable than any throne they might have inherited, and more lasting than any kingdom they might rule.